For 20 years, Ichiro Mori had managed every yen that flowed through the Kuroda clan's financial operations, and not one person inside the organization knew that the man they trusted with their entire fortune did not legally exist. A secret hidden so completely that even his closest colleagues would have sworn under oath that they knew exactly who he was. Subscribe and stay until the end, because the accident that exposed his secret was something nobody could have ever planned. Ichiro had built a reputation across 2 decades as the most meticulous financial mind the Kuroda clan had ever employed, a man whose precision with numbers bordered on obsessive, whose memory for transaction details rivaled any computer system the organization had ever invested in. Senior leadership trusted him completely, not simply because of his competence, but because of the particular kind of loyalty he had demonstrated since the day Kenzo Kuroda first hired him, a loyalty tested repeatedly across 2 decades and never once found wanting. What none of them understood was that the man called Ichiro Mori had been born under an entirely different name, a name erased so thoroughly 20 years earlier that even the most thorough background investigation the clan had conducted before hiring him found nothing suspicious to question. The truth began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when a routine traffic accident outside the clan's financial offices nearly cost Ichiro his life and exposed a secret he had spent 2 decades protecting with meticulous, unwavering discipline. A delivery truck lost control on the wet pavement outside the building where Ichiro worked, striking him as he crossed the street during his lunch break, the impact sending him sprawling across the asphalt as bystanders rushed forward to help. The impact was severe enough to require immediate hospitalization, severe enough that doctors needed to access his medical history within hours to ensure proper treatment. When hospital administrators attempted to verify his identity through the standard documentation Ichiro had used for the past 20 years, something inconsistent appeared in the National Identification Database, a discrepancy minor enough that hospital staff initially assumed clerical error rather than deliberate deception. But the discrepancy caught the attention of a young administrator named Yuna, whose background in fraud detection at her previous job made her more thorough than most hospital staff would have been in cross-referencing identification documents during an emergency admission, a habit of careful diligence she had never expected to matter in a medical setting. What Yuna discovered, working quietly through records over the following 2 days while Ichiro remained unconscious, was that the identity documents connected to Ichiro Mori had been created exactly 21 years earlier, with no verifiable history existing before that specific date. No birth records, no school records, nothing connecting the man currently fighting for his life in the hospital's intensive care unit to any documented existence prior to a single carefully constructed identity that simply appeared from nowhere 2 decades earlier, a discovery that unsettled her more than she expected it to. Yuna, uncertain whether this represented criminal activity worth reporting or simply an unusual immigration situation requiring discretion, made a decision that would ultimately determine everything that followed. Rather than immediately alerting authorities, she reached out quietly to Kenzo Kuroda directly, having learned through hospital records that Ichiro's emergency contact listed him as employer rather than family. The conversation between Yuna and Kenzo, conducted carefully over the following days, as Ichiro slowly recovered consciousness, revealed information that would eventually force Kenzo to confront a truth about his most trusted financial advisor that none of his other lieutenants yet knew anything about. When Ichiro finally regained full consciousness 4 days after the accident, he found Kenzo waiting beside his hospital bed, an expression on the old man's face that Ichiro had never witnessed in 20 years of service. "The hospital found something in your identification records," Kenzo said quietly, watching Ichiro's reaction carefully. 21 years of nothing before the man I hired. I think it's time you told me who you actually are." Ichiro understood immediately that the secret he had protected for 2 decades had finally unraveled through circumstances entirely beyond his control. An accident that exposed in days what careful planning had concealed for 20 years, a fragility he had never fully accounted for despite years of meticulous discipline. The truth Ichiro finally revealed traced back to events that occurred when he was a young man named Daichi Saito, the son of a mid-level lieutenant inside a rival organization that had been systematically destroyed during a brutal territorial war exactly 21 years earlier, a conflict that predated Kenzo's own rise to leadership within the Kuroda clan by nearly a decade. Daiichi's father had been executed during that conflict, along with nearly every senior member of his organization, in a purge so thorough that the rival clan effectively ceased to exist within months. Daiichi, only 19 at the time, survived only because he had been away from clan territory during the violence, studying finance at a university his father had insisted he attend, despite the organization's general distrust of outside education, a decision that ultimately saved his life without his father ever knowing it would. Returning home to discover his entire world destroyed, Daiichi faced an impossible choice. The organizations responsible for the purge would likely view him as a potential threat requiring elimination, a loose end connected to an enemy they had worked to completely erase from the region's criminal landscape. His only path toward survival required becoming someone else entirely, severing every connection to his previous identity so completely that nobody could ever trace Ichiro Mori back to the son of a man executed during a war he had never personally participated in. He spent months constructing a new identity through underground document forgers who specialized in exactly this kind of complete erasure, emerging as Ichiro Mori, a financial graduate with no family connections, no history, nothing that could ever connect him to the violence that had destroyed everything he previously knew. A transformation so complete that even his own reflection sometimes felt unfamiliar during those early disorienting months. The bitter irony, one Ichiro had carried silently for 20 years, was that the organization eventually hiring him as their most trusted financial expert was the very same clan responsible for orchestrating the destruction of his original family, though led now by Kenzo, rather than the previous leadership who had ordered the original purge. "I never sought revenge," Ichiro told Kenzo, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone finally releasing a secret carried far too long. "I needed survival, not vengeance. Working for this organization wasn't strategy. It was simply the only opportunity available to someone with my particular financial training in this region. I had no idea, when I accepted the position 20 years ago, that I was rebuilding my life inside the walls of the very organization that destroyed my original one." Kenzo absorbed the revelation slowly, understanding immediately the impossible position this created for both men. The purge that destroyed Daiichi's family had occurred under previous leadership, decisions made before Kenzo himself rose to power, yet the organization currently benefiting from Ichiro's 20 years of loyal service remained directly connected to violence that had orphaned him as a teenager. "You've spent 2 decades managing this clan's fortune," Kenzo finally said, "fully aware that we were responsible for your father's death." "I made peace with that contradiction years ago," Ichiro said. "The men who ordered that purge are dead now. You inherited leadership of an organization, not the specific sins of the leaders who came before you. I judged you by what you actually did during your own leadership, not by crimes committed before you held any power to prevent them, and over 20 years, what you actually did was lead with more fairness than most men in your position ever bother attempting." The conversation left Kenzo with a decision more complicated than simply addressing fraudulent identification documents. Ichiro's deception, however understandable given the circumstances that created it, represented exactly the kind of fundamental dishonesty that could theoretically justify severe consequences within an organization built on absolute trust between leadership and its most senior advisors. But the deeper truth complicated any straightforward response. Ichiro had spent 20 years demonstrating loyalty and competence that exceeded virtually every other lieutenant inside the organization, building genuine value through service that had nothing to do with the circumstances that originally forced his deception. Kenzo's senior advisors, once informed of the situation through careful, controlled disclosure, split sharply over how the organization should respond. Several argued that any deception regarding fundamental identity represented an unacceptable risk regardless of motivation, a precedent that could theoretically be exploited by genuine infiltrators using similar justifications, a concern that carried real weight given the violent history both organizations shared. Others, including Takeshi, the clan's security chief who had worked alongside Ichiro for over 15 years, argued forcefully that punishing someone for surviving circumstances created entirely by the organization's own previous violence represented exactly the kind of injustice that eroded genuine loyalty among those who served faithfully. A point he made with unusual passion for a man typically defined by careful neutrality. "He didn't infiltrate us to cause harm," Takeshi argued during a tense advisory meeting, his hands flat on the table as he leaned forward to make his point. "He survived a purge we orchestrated, built an honest life through legitimate skill, and happened to end up serving the very organization responsible for destroying his family. That's not betrayal, that's circumstance." The debate stretched across several tense days, during which Ichiro remained uncertain whether 20 years of demonstrated loyalty would ultimately matter against the fundamental fact of his deception, however justified the original circumstances had been. Kenzo's final decision required confronting a deeper question about what genuine loyalty actually meant within an organization where trust had always been measured through unwavering adherence to absolute rules rather than nuanced understanding of circumstance and consequence. 20 years ago, this organization destroyed your family through violence that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with consolidating power, Kenzo finally told Ichiro, addressing him in front of the full assembled leadership for the first time since the truth emerged, his voice carrying none of the formal distance the room typically expected from him. "You built an entirely new life through skill and discipline, ultimately serving this organization with a level of loyalty that exceeded men who never had to question their place within it." The room remained silent, uncertain where Kenzo's reflection was leading. "I won't punish you for surviving circumstances I had no part in creating, but inherited the responsibility to address regardless," Kenzo continued. "Your identity remains protected, your position remains secure, but I want every lieutenant in this room to understand something important about what we just learned. The greatest threats to this organization were never people like Ichiro, who survived our own violence and chose loyalty anyway. They've always been the kind of leadership that creates circumstances like this in the first place, violence so thoughtless it manufactures enemies from people who never wanted to be enemies at all." 6 months later, Ichiro Mori continued managing the Kuroda clan's financial operations with the same meticulous precision that had defined his 20 years of service, though now operating without the exhausting burden of a secret he had carried silently since he was 19 years old. His relationship with Kenzo evolved into something neither expected, built on a foundation of honesty that proved far stronger than the careful distance maintained throughout their previous 2 decades of professional association. Yuna, the hospital administrator whose thoroughness had inadvertently exposed 2 decades of carefully maintained secrecy, received quiet but significant compensation for her discretion, having handled an extraordinarily delicate situation with judgment that protected everyone involved rather than triggering consequences nobody could have controlled. And Ichiro, finally free from the constant vigilance required to maintain a fabricated identity for 20 years, understood something about the nature of survival that took him 2 decades to fully accept, a realization that settled slowly rather than arriving all at once. The name he had constructed to escape his past was never truly who he had become. The man who spent 20 years building genuine trust through honest service, regardless of the lie hidden beneath his identity, had always been more real than the fabricated history designed to protect him. Survival had required becoming someone else entirely. But loyalty, the kind built through 2 decades of consistent integrity despite circumstances that could have justified resentment instead, had always belonged entirely to him, untouched by the fabricated name written above it.